My nephew walked in while I was playing with my cat. I didn't expect it, so I had to do this. That evening, I was ready for some peace and quiet. The rain outside, the soft glow of candles, and the warmth of a hot bath were all I needed to unwind. But then I heard it. A faint sound, barely a creak, but enough to set my nerves on edge. What followed was a series of moments so strange and unsettling that it left me questioning everything about that night and about him. The evening had been one of those rare moments when the house felt completely still. My younger brother, Liam, was out with friends, and his teenage son, Caleb, had slipped away to do whatever it is teenagers do when they want to avoid adults. For once, I had the entire house to myself, save for our lazy ginger cat, Bella, who sprawled across the couch like she owned the place. I cherished moments like these. With a cup of tea in hand, I settled into the living room and let the sound of rain tapping against the windows lull me into relaxation. Bella gave a soft, approving purr, as if acknowledging that this was her kingdom and I was merely a guest. After a light dinner, I decided to treat myself to a hot bath. It was my favorite way to unwind, a ritual of warmth and quiet that always seemed to wash away the day's stress. Bella, ever my shadow, padded after me to the bathroom, but stopped at the doorway, watching me with her curious amber eyes. I filled the tub, the steam curling up to fog the mirror, and locked the door. A habit, even when alone. Bella gave a low, disapproving meow, as if to question my decision, but she soon lost interest and trotted back to the living room. As I sank into the water, the tension in my muscles began to melt away. The glow of candles flickered on the walls, and the only sound was the rain. My eyes closed, and for the first time in days, I felt truly at peace. But then I heard it, a soft creak from the hallway. At first, I told myself it was nothing. This was an old house, after all. It had its share of quirks, the groans and creaks of aged wood expanding and settling, especially on damp nights like this one. Still, something about that sound unsettled me. It didn't have the randomness of the usual house noises. It was deliberate, like the cautious step of someone trying not to be heard. I sat up slightly in the tub, straining to listen. The faint sound came again, closer this time, like it was just outside the bathroom door. "Bella?" I called out, my voice a little too loud in the quiet. No response. I waited, my heart beginning to pick up pace. Maybe she had decided to wander back, her little paws making the noise. That had to be it. But then, beneath the thin sliver of light under the bathroom door, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't Bella. The shadow shifted just slightly, as if whoever it was standing perfectly still, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. My breath caught in my throat, and the once soothing sound of the rain outside now felt oppressive, drowning out any chance of hearing more subtle noises. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. A beat of silence. Then, faintly, came a voice I recognized. "Sorry, Aunt Clara. It's me, Caleb." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You scared me," I said, my voice a mix of relief and frustration. "What are you doing creeping around out there?" "I didn't know you were in there," he said, his tone unusually quiet. "I'll go." His footsteps retreated down the hall, and I sank back into the tub, trying to calm the adrenaline rushing through my veins. But something about the interaction left me uneasy. Caleb's voice didn't sound right. It was flat, almost mechanical, and entirely unlike the joking, sarcastic teen I knew. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to teenage awkwardness. I stayed in the bath a little longer, letting the warmth soothe my nerves. But the feeling of unease lingered, and by the time I stepped out and wrapped myself in a towel, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. When I emerged from the bathroom, the hallway was quiet, but the stillness felt different now, more watchful. Bella was waiting for me at the doorway, her tail flicking with what I could only describe as nervous energy. Her wide amber eyes seemed to ask, "Did you see that too?" I dried off and slipped into something comfortable before heading downstairs. The soft tapping of Bella's paws followed me, a small comfort in the growing unease. In the kitchen, I found Caleb sitting at the table. He was nursing a mug of coffee, black and way too strong for someone his age, judging by the way he winced with every sip. His hair was messy, his posture slouched, and his eyes looked heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone light as I poured myself a cup of tea. "You're up late." He glanced at me briefly before looking back at his mug. "Yeah, couldn't sleep. he muttered. I joined him at the table, trying to gauge his mood. Bella leapt onto my lap and curled up, her soft purring filling the silence. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah, Caleb said too quickly. He hesitated, then added, just school stuff. You know how it is. I nodded, but his answer didn't convince me. This wasn't the same Caleb who usually filled the house with his sarcastic humor and relentless energy. This version of him was quiet, withdrawn, and, dare I say, haunted. The silence stretched on, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall. I searched for something to say, anything to break the tension. Did you get back late tonight? He shrugged. Not too late. His answers were clipped, his body language closed off. I could feel an invisible wall between us, one I didn't know how to breach. Bella, as if sensing the awkwardness, hopped off my lap and padded over to Caleb. She rubbed against his leg, her way of offering comfort. For a moment, he softened. He reached down to stroke her fur, and I saw a flicker of the Caleb I knew, but just as quickly his hand froze and he pulled away. I'm gonna head upstairs, he said abruptly, standing up and avoiding my eyes. Okay, I said, watching as he left the kitchen. Bella followed him partway up the stairs before pausing and looking back at me, her tail twitching. I sighed, finishing my tea in silence. That brief interaction left me with more questions than answers. Why was Caleb acting so strange? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that something deeper was going on? The rest of the night dragged on uneventfully. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred together, my mind too preoccupied. Even as I settled into bed, Bella curling up beside me, my thoughts kept returning to Caleb and the shadow under the bathroom door. The next morning, I woke to the pale sunlight filtering through the curtains. Bella was sprawled beside me, purring softly in her sleep. For a moment, I felt a fragile sense of calm. Maybe I had overthought everything last night, but when I went downstairs, that sense of calm vanished. Caleb was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with another mug of coffee. His shoulders were hunched, and his eyes were fixed on the window, lost in thought. Morning, I said, keeping my voice casual as I grabbed a mug from the cabinet. Morning, he replied, not looking at me. The silence between us felt heavier than the day before. Bella trotted into the room and leapt onto her usual chair, her tail flicking as she watched Caleb intently. I busied myself with the coffee maker, stealing glances at him. You seemed a bit off last night, I ventured. Is everything okay? He paused, his fingers drumming against the table. Yeah, just a lot on my mind, he said, his voice distant. What kind of things? I pressed gently, sitting across from him. He finally met my eyes, and I saw it again. That flicker of something deeper, something he wasn't saying. You wouldn't get it, he muttered, looking away. I leaned forward. Try me. For a moment, he looked like he might open up, but then he shook his head and stood abruptly. I need to clear my head, he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. Caleb, I started, but he was already heading for the door. I stood there, watching him leave, frustration and worry swirling inside me. Bella rubbed against my leg, her way of grounding me. I sighed, scratching behind her ears. What's going on with him, Bella? The rest of the day passed in a blur of chores and half-hearted attempts at distraction. I cleaned, answered emails, and even started prepping dinner, but I couldn't stop thinking about Caleb. The way he looked at me this morning, it wasn't anger or sadness. It was something else, something I couldn't put into words. When Caleb returned in the evening, he seemed more composed. He offered a small smile when he walked into the kitchen, where I was setting the table. Smells good, he said, his tone lighter than it had been all day. Thought we could have dinner together, I said, hoping to bridge the growing gap between us. He nodded, sitting down at the table as I served the food. At first, we stuck to small talk, school, the weather, mundane things. But as the meal went on, the conversation started to flow more naturally. For the first time in days, I felt like we were connecting again. After dinner, as I was clearing the plates, Caleb lingered in the doorway. Aunt Clara, he said quietly. I turned, surprised to see him standing so close. His expression was serious, almost hesitant, and his hands were tucked into his pockets. I wanted to say thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For what? I asked, setting the plates down on the counter. For everything, he said, meeting my eyes. for putting up with me, for caring, even when I don't make it easy. His words caught me off guard. Before I could respond, he stepped closer. It wasn't threatening or awkward, just intentional. And then, in a moment that felt both tender and charged, he leaned in and gave me a light kiss on the cheek. I froze, unsure how to respond. It wasn't romantic or inappropriate. It was gratitude, an expression of emotions he couldn't quite articulate. I stepped back slightly, offering him a reassuring smile. "You don't need to thank me, Caleb. That's what family is for." He nodded, his expression softening. "Good night, Aunt Clara," he said before retreating upstairs. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Bella jumped onto the counter, her gaze fixed on me with an almost knowing look. "Don't judge me," I muttered, stroking her fur. The house was quiet again as the evening wore on. I settled into the living room, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea in my hands. Bella sat beside me, her amber eyes fixed on the doorway, as if she were expecting someone. I couldn't stop replaying the moment with Caleb in my mind. The kiss on the cheek, the gratitude in his voice. It wasn't the act itself that unsettled me, but the intensity of the emotions behind it. Caleb wasn't just thanking me, he was reaching out in a way he hadn't before. When I finally went to bed, Bella curled up at my feet, her steady purring a small comfort in the stillness of the night. Sleep didn't come easily, though. My thoughts were a storm of questions. Was Caleb okay? Had I done enough to make him feel supported? The next morning, I woke up early, the pale sunlight filtering through the curtains. Bella was already awake, perched by the window, her tail flicking as she watched the world outside. I went downstairs to find Caleb already in the kitchen. He was staring out the window, a half-empty cup of coffee in his hand. His posture was relaxed, but there was a quietness about him that hadn't been there before. "Good morning," I said, my voice breaking the silence. He turned, offering me a small smile. "Morning." As I poured myself a cup of tea, I tried to think of how to approach him. The tension from the previous days seemed to have eased, but I could still sense a weight hanging over him. "Caleb," I began, sitting down across from him. "About last night." He looked up, his expression wary but open. "I just want you to know," I said carefully, "that you can always talk to me about anything. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." His gaze dropped to his coffee, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to respond. But then he nodded. "I know, I don't always know how to say what I'm feeling." "That's okay," I said. "Sometimes just trying is enough." He glanced up at me, and in his eyes I saw a mixture of relief and vulnerability. "Thanks, Aunt Clara," he said quietly, "for being here." "Always," I replied, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. For the first time in days, the tension between us seemed to dissolve. It wasn't a dramatic resolution, but it was enough. A step toward understanding and connection. That night, as I sat curled up on the couch, Bella purring softly beside me, my thoughts wandered back to the moments that had unfolded over the past few days. There was something about Caleb's actions, his hesitation, his subdued tone, even his awkward attempts to connect, that nagged at me. These weren't just the whims of teenage angst, they were a cry for something deeper. The room was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves outside the window. I reached over to the bookshelf and pulled down an old photo album, its spine creased from years of use. As I flipped through the pages, memories came flooding back. There he was, Caleb as a toddler, covered in frosting at his first birthday. A few pages later, he was grinning from ear to ear, holding up a soccer trophy that was almost bigger than he was. He was always so full of life, always moving, always laughing. But somewhere in the more recent photos, his smile began to fade. It wasn't obvious at first, just little hints, a forced grin here, a distracted gaze there. "When did it all change, Bella?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over her steady purring. Bella looked up at me with her wide amber eyes, tilting her head as if she could sense the weight of my thoughts. She let out a soft meow, nudging my hand for attention. I obliged, running my fingers through her fur as I stared at the album. It hit me then, how easy it had been to overlook the signs. Life had a way of pulling everyone in different directions. Between work, obligations, and the day-to-day chaos, I'd convinced myself that Caleb was just growing up, becoming more independent. But was he? Or was he drifting away, trying to navigate a world that felt too big and too overwhelming. I closed the album and leaned back against the couch, the weight of my own guilt settling in. It wasn't too late to fix this. I could still reach him, but I needed to start paying attention. Bella, as if reading my mind, hopped onto my lap and curled into a ball, her soft purring vibrating against me. "All right, Bella," I murmured. "Tomorrow we start fresh. I need to let him know he's not alone." The thought brought a small sense of comfort, but as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I couldn't help but wonder, would Caleb let me in? Or had I waited too long? The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting the room in soft, warm hues. Bella was already awake, perched by the window and watching the world outside with her usual quiet curiosity. Today felt different, like a day to take action, to start bridging the gap between Caleb and me. I wasn't going to wait for another awkward moment or a fleeting opportunity. It was time to reach out. After making a quick breakfast, I knocked on Caleb's door. There was a pause before I heard his muffled response. "Come in." I opened the door to find him sprawled across his bed, earbuds in, staring at the ceiling. A notebook sat open beside him, filled with scattered notes and doodles. He pulled out one earbud and looked at me, surprised. "Morning," I said with a smile. "How's it going?" He shrugged. "Okay, I guess." I hesitated for a moment, then decided to dive right in. "I was thinking, maybe we could do something together today. Just the two of us." His eyebrows shot up. "Like what?" "Anything," I said. "A walk in the park, ice cream, maybe check out that new bookstore downtown." He stared at me for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the suggestion. I braced myself for a dismissive no, but then a small smile broke across his face. "The park sounds cool." A wave of relief washed over me. "Great. Get ready, and we'll head out in a bit." The walk in the park turned out to be exactly what we both needed. Caleb started to open up, sharing bits and pieces about his friends, his classes, and even a funny story about a teacher who couldn't figure out how to work the projector. For the first time in weeks, I saw glimpses of the Caleb I remembered, the one who laughed easily and had a spark in his eyes. As we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, Caleb turned to me. His expression had softened, his usual guardedness replaced with something more vulnerable. "Thanks for today, Aunt Clara. I didn't realize how much I needed this." I smiled, my heart swelling at his words. "Me too, Caleb. Me too." That evening, the house had a different energy. It wasn't just the lingering warmth of the sun setting after our trip to the park. It was the shift in Caleb's demeanor. The heaviness that had hung over him for days seemed lighter, almost as if our time together had cracked open a window for him to breathe. Dinner was surprisingly easy. Caleb and I sat at the table, talking about everything and nothing. He told me more about his friends, his favorite music, and even a few funny stories from school. For the first time in a while, the conversation felt natural, not forced. As I cleared the dishes, Caleb lingered in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his hands in his pockets. "Aunt Clara," he said, his voice quiet. I turned, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. "Yeah? I wanted to say thanks," he said, his words coming out slowly, deliberately. "For, putting up with me. For caring, even when I'm not exactly easy to deal with." His honesty caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Caleb," I began, setting the dishes on the counter. "You don't need to thank me. That's what family is for. We're in this together, okay?" He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. Then, as if gathering his courage, he looked up again. "I don't say it enough, but I'm really glad you're here. It means a lot." The sincerity in his voice tugged at my heart. Before I could respond, he stepped forward and gave me a quick hug, something so brief and unexpected that I almost didn't know how to react. When he pulled away, there was a faint blush on his cheeks, and he quickly excused himself, heading upstairs. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough, a small, meaningful step toward rebuilding the bridge between us. Bella padded into the kitchen, looking up at me with her curious eyes. "Looks like we're making progress, huh, Bella?" I said, scooping her up into my arms. She gave a soft purr, her way of agreeing. Life often gives us subtle moments to reconnect with the people who matter most. Moments that might seem small but carry immense weight. Whether it's a heartfelt conversation, a simple walk in the park, or even sitting together in silence, These are the connections that anchor us, that remind us we're not alone. If this story resonated with you, think about someone in your life who might need that connection. Maybe they're struggling in silence, waiting for someone to reach out. Be that person. It doesn't take grand gestures, just your presence, your patience, and your willingness to listen. Have you ever experienced a moment like this with someone you care about? Share your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear how you've navigated similar experiences. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that explore the quiet but powerful moments that shape our lives.